In early 1945, most Nazi forces in Europe were in retreat, pursued by the Americans and British from the west and Soviet forces from the east. Large areas of Europe, which had been under Nazi control since 1940 or 1941, now found themselves liberated. In the case of nations of Eastern Europe like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, the Soviets replaced Nazis as occupiers. Nazi forces remained longer than expected and certainly longer than necessary. But they had work to do. As agents of the USSR worked behind the scenes to Sovietize these countries, in other words, to give each of them a puppet government that would serve as an extension of the Kremlin. These governments had the appearance of democratic representatives, but in reality they were neither. Local communists were gathered into a coalition party. They handed power, usually after coups or rigged elections. Soviet agents were appointed as advisors, but were in fact monitors, informers and enforcers. Other parties were dissolved and registers were eliminated. Much of Eastern Europe was cloaked behind what soon became known as the Iron Curtain. So by the start of 1946, the process of Sovietization was well underway in these countries, which collectively became known as the Eastern Bloc or the Soviet Bloc. Access to the Eastern Bloc was tightly restricted, so there were no foreign journalists permitted and diplomatic access was minimal. However, the West did have some information about what was transpiring there. The tensions between the USSR and the West began to acquire a public voice. In a February 1946 speech, Stalin stressed the superiority of communism over capitalism, warning Russians to stay on their guard against the West. Meanwhile, Winston Churchill, no longer British Prime Minister, after an election defeat in July 1945, accused Stalin of breaking promises made at Yalta. In March 1946, Churchill visited the US and spoke at Fulton, Missouri about his concerns. A shadow has fallen upon the scenes recently lightened by the Allied victory. Nobody knows what Soviet Russia intends to do in the immediate future or what are the limits, if any, to their expansive tendencies. It is my duty to place before you certain facts about the present situation in Europe, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trezik in the Adriatic. An Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe: Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest and Sofia. All these famous cities are subject to a very high and increasing measure of control from Moscow. This is certainly not the liberated Europe we fought to build up. Meanwhile, behind this Iron Curtain, the Soviets were helping themselves to the raw materials and industrial resources of occupied nations. Grain, food, machinery, steel, coal and other items were seized and transported to east to the Soviet Union. Romania and Hungary, which had aligned themselves with Nazi Germany during the war, suffered worse. As defeated enemy states, both were required to sign humiliating armistice documents with the Soviet leadership, agreeing to pay reparations to the Russian people. These documents were little more than a license to plunder, as reported by Kertész. So he said the armistice agreement compelled Hungary to furnish goods, facilities and services for the occupying army. The Soviet Union took the old principle of the war must feed the war seriously, and the Red Army lived off the land. Beside carrying the legal burden of the armistice obligations, Hungary suffered through illegal seizures and large-scale looting. The notion of a war booty was interpreted most extensively. Valuable machines and in numerous instances whole plants were dismantled and removed to the Soviet Union. Grains and other victuals were seized in huge quantities. Almost one half of the livestock was taken out of the country. Safe deposit boxes were forced open and their contents removed. Whether the property was private or public did not make any difference. Private homes, public warehouses, stores, government agencies and banks all received the same treatment. The properties of the neutral powers, such as Switzerland, Sweden and Turkey, were not spared. The announcement of the Marshall Plan by the Americans in mid-1947 revealed the extent that these nations were under Stalin's control. All 6 members of the Eastern Bloc refused invitation to the Paris Negotiation Conference, despite Poland and Czechoslovakia having earlier expressed some interest in accepting US aid. Moscow's control of the Eastern Bloc governments became less covert at this time. In September 1947, the USSR established Cominform, so the Communist Information Bureau, which linked the communist governments of Eastern Europe and ensured that they adopted policies approved by Moscow. Several Czechoslovak, Romanian, Hungarian and Bulgarian communists who failed to toe the line were reported by Cominform, arrested, given Stalin's show trials and executed. Each Eastern Bloc government formed its own secret police base on the Soviet NKVD, including the Stasi, to East Germany, Romania, Czechoslovakia and Bulgaria, and the AVH is Hungary. Any pretense that these countries were independent or discrete from the USSR had faded away by the early 1950s. For those living in the Soviet bloc nations, it became gradually more difficult to relocate or travel to other countries. Borders, once relatively open, became guarded and tightly controlled. Europe's border controls, once relatively relaxed, became the strictest in its peacetime history. This division was keenly felt in Germany, which was split asunder by Soviet and Allied occupation zones. The twin towns of Sonneberg and Neustadt found themselves in the Soviet and Allied zones respectively, and separated by the Iron Curtain. In July 1949, the two towns participated in a soccer game, played on a pitch which boundary line formed the east-west border, allowing those on both sides to watch the match without passes. More than 25,000 spectators attended, some holding up place cards demanding the two towns, and indeed the entire German nation, be reunified. After the match, Soviet officials opened the border for the afternoon, allowing thousands of Sonneberg residents to visit family, friends and shops in the Neustadt well-stocked businesses. Optimistic events like the East-West football matches and border openings provided some hope that the borders would one day be relaxed or dissolved. But as pro-Moscow governments settled into power in the east, they began to strengthen border controls, to lock out anti-communist infiltrators and demonstrators, as well as preventing an exodus of their own people to the west. In 1951, East Germany began a building program to fortify vulnerable parts of its border, erecting barbed wire, towers, gates and guard posts. Some heavily populated areas fringing the border were cleared of people. Roads, railways and tunnels crossing borders were destroyed, dug up or diverted. Ground near the border was cleared and in some cases packed with landmines. In 1949, it had been possible to cross the border into Allied-occupied Germany if one was determined enough. Within 4 years, the border was sealed, government authorised crossings were strictly controlled, and unauthorised crossings were dangerous. The Iron Curtain was not only a political and philosophical concept, it was now real and tangible. Okay, 5 things to remember. The Iron Curtain was coined by Winston Churchill in 1946 for the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe. From 1947 to 1951, billions of dollars of US loans were advanced to European nations for post-war rebuilding. These loans came with strict conditions such as the adoption of liberal, democratic and capitalist policies. This aid enabled the reconstruction of Europe while advancing American commercial and foreign policy interests. In the context of the Cold War, the Marshall Plan helped weak and war-ravaged governments and economies to recover without falling prey to communist infiltration and thus being swallowed by the Soviet bloc. The Truman Doctrine was the United States' first definitive Cold War policy. The road to the Truman Doctrine began with the death of Franklin Roosevelt, who had been the US president since January 1933. During his time in office, Roosevelt responded to several great challenges, not the least was overseeing the reconstruction of the nation after the devastation of the Great Depression. When World War II erupted in 1939, Roosevelt remained true to America's long-standing commitment to neutrality. But he also supported America's allies, particularly Britain, through the development of the Lend-Lease program. 2 years later, after the American base at Pearl Harbor was attacked by the Japanese, Roosevelt declared it a date which will live in infamy, as he committed American might to the European War. Roosevelt's leadership was instrumental in vanquishing two great tyrannies, Nazism, and Japanese military imperialism. Sadly, he would not live to see the final defeat of either. Weakened by years of paralysis, smoking, and stress, Roosevelt's own days were numbered. In November 1944, he was swept back into power for a record fourth term, but he would serve barely another 4 months. On April 12, 1945, Roosevelt, while resting at his holiday home in Georgia, said, "I have a terrific pain in the back of my head," then slumped unconscious at his desk. The pain was a massive stroke, and the president never regained consciousness. So the leadership passed to Roosevelt's vice president, Harry S. Truman. He was a relatively inexperienced politician, and he was hurried into the vice presidency the previous year. Truman was a World War I veteran and former shopkeeper with comparatively little education. He didn't attend school until he was 8, and he was the only 20th century president without a college degree. So Truman had been a US Senator since 1935, where he received some press attention for heading a committee which cracked down on wasteful spending and corruption in the military. Truman had a reputation as a plain-speaking, no-nonsense politician who got things done, but he was by no means an ideal candidate for the presidency, as suggested by Roosevelt's decision not to discuss major policies or war tactics with Truman during his 82 days as vice president. In fact, Truman only learnt of the Manhattan Project and the atomic bomb after becoming president. In July 1945, just 3 months after taking office, Truman journeyed to Potsdam, Germany, for a tripartite meeting with Churchill and Stalin. There he would face two considerable difficulties. The first was his own inexperience as president and as a foreign policy negotiator. The second was dealing with Stalin, given that Russian troops had occupied much of Eastern Europe, including Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania, under the pretext of stabilising the region. Truman would write to family members that he enjoyed the company of Stalin, a man who looked him firmly in the eye when speaking, but that the Russians were in general pig-headed negotiators who always sought the upper hand. Truman was much more suspicious of Stalin's motives than Roosevelt had been. He viewed the ongoing Russian occupation of Eastern Europe as the beginning of a Soviet empire, believing that it endangered the rest of the continent. In an attempt to gain the upper hand over Stalin, Truman revealed to him that the US had a new weapon of unusual destructive force, talking about the atomic bomb. But Stalin showed little interest. What Truman did not know is that Soviet spies in the US had already alerted Moscow of the atomic bomb. In fact, Stalin had known about it before Truman did. Truman spent much of the 2 years after the war dealing with American domestic economic issues. However, he also kept one eye on Soviet encroachment in Eastern Europe. An important source of advice on Soviet Russia was America's embassy in Moscow. In February 1946, the Deputy Ambassador George Kennan sent a lengthy telegram to the US Treasury Department summarising his view of the USSR, its government ideology and objectives. The long telegram, as it has become known, became the foundation of American attitudes during the Cold War. Kennan argued that the Soviet Union was hell-bent on the destruction of capitalism and would seize any opportunity to advance communism in countries that were weak, politically unstable, or recovering from the ravages of war. Of the struggle between Western capitalism and Soviet communism, Kennan noted that much depends on health and vigour of our own society. World communism is like a malignant parasite which feeds only on diseased tissue. This is point of which domestic and foreign policies meets. Every courageous and incisive measure to solve internal problems for our own society, to improve self-confidence, discipline, morale and community spirit of our own people, is a diplomatic victory over Moscow. We must formulate and put forward for our other nations a much more positive and constructive picture of the sort of world we would like to see than we have been put forward in the past. It is not enough to urge people to develop political processes similar to our own. Many foreign people in Europe, at least, are tired and frightened by experiences of the past and are less interested in abstract freedom than in security. They are seeking guidance rather than responsibilities. We should be better able than the Russians to give them this, and unless we do, the Russians certainly will. So Truman accepted Keenan's final recommendations and used it as a basis for his foreign policy towards the USSR. Truman argued that several European nations were weak and at risk of being annexed or unduly influenced by totalitarianism, so the US should assist those nations to make their own decisions. In March 1947, he outlined this very more definitively in a speech to Congress, which later became known as the Truman Doctrine. At the present moment in world history, nearly every nation must choose between alternative ways of life. The choice is too often not a free one. One way of life is based upon the will of the majority and is distinguished by free institutions, free elections, freedom of speech and religion. The second way of life is based upon terror and oppression, a controlled press and radio, fixed elections and suppression of personal freedoms. I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjection by armed minorities or outside pressures. I believe that we must assist free people to work out their own destinies in their own way. So the two initial focal points for the Truman Doctrine were Greece and Turkey. During World War II, Greece had been invaded by Mussolini's Italian fascists and then occupied by the Nazis. Its citizens had suffered persecution and starvation before being liberated by the British in 1944. Between 1944 and 1949, Greece was racked by a civil war between government and communist forces. The government was initially supported by the British, however London withdrew from Greece in late 1946. Recognising the possibility of a communist victory there, the US Congress issued the Greek government with $400 million in aid. Turkey was more politically stable but was under pressure from the Soviet Union, which was pushing for access to the Dardanelles, a strait linking the Black Sea with the Mediterranean. Turkey was also given $100 million in aid for refusing these overtures from Moscow. Truman's speech to Congress signalled a transition in American foreign policy from a state of relative calm and amicable relations to containment, a more aggressive policy aimed at restricting Soviet expansion and influence. The Truman Doctrine would underpin some well-known Cold War policies, including the Marshall Plan, nuclear armament, and the formation of NATO. It drew an angry response from the Soviet Union, one newsreel in Moscow suggesting President Truman's message to Congress is a threat to the principles of the United Nations. The US needs to serve the interests of its huge business corporations, which are out for world domination. The USA is trying to establish its control over Greece and Turkey by means of dollar diplomacy. The Soviet Union accused Truman of talking nonsense about the dangers of Soviet expansion whilst exploiting countries on the pretext of providing aid to them.